organ lesson. You know, when we'd finished the Orgelbüchlein, recorded the last episode and put it out, one or two people commented that they were feeling quite bereft, not having any more left to do. And to be quite honest, I felt a bit the same. And so there was a suggestion that perhaps we could find some more repertoire that was about the same kind of level. That is to say, not absurdly difficult, not beyond the range of what we can do, but at the same time enough to have a bit of a challenge, and perhaps a slightly different epoch, a slightly different style, and maybe somebody suggested something a little bit larger than the short Orgelbüchlein preludes. And Mendelssohn's organ sonatas seem to fit the bill. We're going to choose sonata number 2. There's quite a lot of it, and so we'll split it into 2 episodes. We'll deal with the first movement today, and with the 2 second movements another day. The 6 sonatas, which were composed in 1844 to 45, are great music, all of them, but they are essentially an assemblage of different movements that Mendelssohn had written for other contexts, and therefore some of them seem to be a bit of a loose collage. But sonata number 2 seems somehow to be the most coherent in the set. It consists of an initial slow movement, which is in 2 sections, a grave followed by an adagio, a very lyrical adagio, and then there is a lively allegro, and then to finish with a fugue. All of these movements are of the same very high quality, while some of the other sonatas seem to vary just a little bit in quality between the movements. And also, sonata number 2 contains perhaps the fewest technical demands of the various sonatas, and so that's the reason that we've chosen number 2 to look at today. So let's get going with the first movement. There are lots of questions to ask, and perhaps the first one we'll deal with is tempo. Mendelssohn was not one of those late Romantic composers who really favoured a great deal of rubato, flexibility. But he specified, in fact, that he wanted the music to be played relatively straight. He also favoured quite brisk tempi, although he did warn that the music should never sound rushed. Unusually, he gives metronome marks, and when we look at those metronome marks, we find that, by and large, they are indeed quite brisk. In fact, some editions have gone so far as to change Mendelssohn's metronome marks to slower ones, which is really something we shouldn't do. If we decide, and it's a big if we decide to disregard Mendelssohn's metronome marks and to use our own, then we should really first ask ourselves the question, if there is a conflict between our own perception and Mendelssohn's metronome marks, who really knows better? So I think we should be very reluctant indeed to deliberately override Mendelssohn's tempo marks. There's no suggestion that he got them wrong, although one or 2 editors have said, well, he went through in rather a hurry afterwards and put them in. I'm not quite so sure. So we need to take those metronome marks quite seriously in any event. So for this first movement, Mendelssohn writes crotchet equals 69 for the grave, which again really is a little bit faster than many people choose to play it, and quaver 72 for the adagio, which also doesn't hang about. So the next question is registration. We often think of Mendelssohn as a Romantic composer, and therefore are tempted to play him on big Romantic instruments with lots of stops. That is really not the case. What kind of instrument did Mendelssohn play? Well, it might surprise us to learn that he played, for example, a Silbermann organ, that is to say, a Bach organ essentially, And certainly the instruments which were available at the time in the 1830s were, on the whole, instruments which reflected a slightly earlier epoch, that is to say, with good, rich foundation stops and fairly bright upperwork. And Mendelssohn, when he wasn't playing his Silbermann, he also favoured particularly the instruments of the Silbermann apprentice generation, so Joachim Wagner and such people. In any event, by no means the kind of big, romantic, thick sound that we might immediately turn to when we think about a romantic composer. In addition, there were very few registration aids, so combination pistons are really out. You might at the most have a couple of mechanical levers to assist the choice of stops. And similarly, although the swell pedal had been invented, the swell box had been invented a century earlier in England, it was by no means widespread in Germany, and certainly there was no balanced swell pedal that could be wiggled at will. So, all in all, go easy on the technology and think fairly conservatively about the registration and about the kind of instrument we play it on. And so I've chosen today, in fact, to use one of the instruments that we used often in the Bach Orgelbüchlein recordings, an instrument which really has a fairly 18th century concept. Mendelssohn does give us some specific directions for what he's thinking about in terms of registration. So for PP, for example, which is relevant to the adagio section of this first movement, he's meaning one 8-foot, quiet 8-foot stop. In this particular case, one quiet 8-foot stop on each manual because it's on 2 manuals. Maybe on many modern organs you might need 2 quiet 8-foot stops on the melody line just to get that richness that Mendelssohn could easily have drawn on a Silbermann or a Joachim Wagner kind of organ. On this particular instrument here, I think I'll just use single 8-foot stops on both the manuals. For F forte, which is the case, for example, for the first half of the first movement and for the fugue, he speaks of a chorus without the most powerful stops. So again, go really easy. We don't want mixtures and reeds in there. On this instrument today, I'm just going to use 8 and 4 principals, in fact, for the opening of the first movement. A double F, incidentally, which is relevant only for the middle movement in this piece, is what Mendelssohn refers to as volle Werk, which is a familiar term in the 18th century, and it means, technically speaking, it means draw all the stops on the main manual. Although, again, in a Baroque organ, we would certainly avoid unnecessary doublings. So that is a quite bright and full sound. Ornaments. This was a big question always in the Bach movements, and really is very little so in Mendelssohn. In fact, I can think offhand of only one trill in the whole of the 6 sonatas, and that is, in fact, in this piece, although it's in the second movement, which we're not looking at today. Otherwise, there's just a handful of arpeggiated prefix notes which crop up from time to time, and we'll deal with when we get to those. A trill, just as a matter of interest, a trill can start on the main note or on the note above in Mendelssohn. Unlike in Bach, where a trill usually starts on the note above, although we did argue that just occasionally the main note could be used in certain circumstances, and I'll refer you to the Bach episodes for that. What we find in Mendelssohn's time, incidentally, the trill in this particular sonata, in Sonata 2, the second movement, the trill has to start on the main note because it is preceded by the note above in the melody line. But what we find in general in Mendelssohn, and I'll mention this here because it does play into other aspects of playing, is that there were, in a sense, two alternative philosophies going on at the same time. So some theorists, in terms of organ music, propose, for example, that trills should start on the upper note with reference to tradition, while others who are more inclined towards the modern piano style of the day, so Czerny and Hummel and such people, say that the trill always should start on the main note. By and large, organists and organ music were held to be rather old-fashioned. What an idea. And that the practices of the 18th century, the traditional practices in Germany, were those that were most employed by organists. So when we're playing Mendelssohn, well, Mendelssohn was an organist and he played old instruments, but at the same time, Mendelssohn was very much a pianist, and he certainly embraced the new piano playing style of doing things. And so I think on the whole, I would suggest for Mendelssohn that we start our trills as a basic premise, at least, on the main note, but that we're by no means reluctant to start on the upper note if, for example, we're preceded by the same note. And even Czerny says that. But that is of relatively little importance for the 6 sonatas because, as I say, there is only that one trill there. I said that this issue of organists being traditional plays into other aspects of playing. And if we look at phrasing and articulation and fingering, which are three things which all belonged very much together, we can see that very clearly. We've spoken before in the Bach episodes about there being a kind of watershed around 1800 in terms of playing philosophy. That this watershed didn't happen overnight, not even within a decade. It was a piecemeal thing, but that if you look at 1750 contra 1850, for example, we see a completely different philosophy going on. Mendelssohn, as we've just said, is located primarily on the other side of that watershed, so the more modern thinking. In terms of fingering, again, we've said before that 18th century fingering is primarily one that heightens the sense of beat. So, for example, strong fingers were put onto strong notes, and the hand could be quite freely moved between beats, thus creating what's known as a differentiated non-legato as the basic style. All that really changes after 1800, or after the watershed, and there is a new style of fingering which emphasizes legato playing. And one of the characteristics of that new style of fingering is passing the thumb under the first finger, or passing the third finger over the thumb on the way down, in order to create a sense of legato which goes beyond the reach of a single beat or of a single hand position. So we need to cultivate a legato fingering. And one of the signs of that is phrasing marks. We get in Mendelssohn quite long phrasing marks, which again stretch over several hand positions and indicate that the fingering is to allow for a legato touch through the whole of that phrase. So this is a new concept, relatively speaking, of phrasing, which entails phrase ends and phrase beginnings and a sense of integrity within phrases. So that's a new thing to cultivate in Mendelssohn in relation to, for example, playing Bach and older music. And so we can move on to what we might call general style. I'm rather interested in the opening of this sonata. Here's a little bit of it here. What's Mendelssohn actually got in mind? Well, I think it's helpful here to look at a few openings of Mendelssohn pieces, not organ works, but other compositions, and to see what general conclusions we can draw. What do we think Mendelssohn is about here? What general ideas are there? Well, I think that the word I would perhaps use to sum up all of those openings is declamatory. Mendelssohn's not one of those composers who starts abstractly or ambiguously. Whether he's being grand or whether he's being gentle, he seems to like making a short statement and then discusses it. And so in the opening of this sonata, I sense that there's two initial figures which move from the tonic to the dominant seventh, that they feel almost like open questions which are then answered by a slightly longer phrase. So a kind of What's this? What's this? Well, this is how it is. And for that reason, I tend personally not to dwell too positively or too long on those main beats. In fact, I find myself shortening them just a little. And that's a bit of a liberty because it's not precisely what Mendelssohn wrote. He could easily have written a quaver followed by 2 quaver rests. So I try not to shorten them quite that much. But even so, I really want them to come across with kind of question marks to be resolved in the longer phrase. And we notice that the phrases, on average, do get longer as we get out of this section and into the rest of that half of the movement. But I think we need to maintain a certain tension throughout this grave section, that all gets released as we flow into that relaxing melody of the gorgeous adagio bit. If you look, incidentally, at the openings of the other 5 Mendelssohn sonatas, we find again and again this sense of a brief opening comment which gets expanded or gets discussed. It seems to be a characteristic of his organ style, as indeed of his orchestral style in many cases. But I think registration, tempo and style in this grave opening can be all summed up as not stodgy. So then we move on to this glorious lyrical adagio, which has to be one of the loveliest of Mendelssohn's movements. As we've already pointed out, the metronome mark suggests that adagio here is by no means a slow adagio, but is really quite flowing, that there needs to be a sense of lyrical flow going on. And we've already observed that Mendelssohn is by no means a fan of rubato, but at the same time I think that this, perhaps of all melodies, is one that demands a little bit of give and take, a little bit of expressivity in the phrases. But it's a piece to enjoy and to love.